Hello and welcome to the Womb-Centered Healing Podcast. I'm Sama Morningstar and I have Natasha here with me today. Thank you so much for joining us. Natasha and I have been engaged in womb-centered healing practices together for quite some time. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast to share your wisdom. We got inspired about talking about hands-on healing, body work modalities, and particularly how they relate to the Enchantress archetype. So for those of you who've been following the podcast, you'll be aware, if you've listened to the past few episodes, that the Enchantress archetype is a term that I'm using to describe the energies that come up for us in our premenstrual and perimenopausal phase. It has a lot to do with evaluating what has been going on, feeling our feelings, all of them, the full spectrum of feelings, and letting that wisdom come forth and guide our choices. And the Enchantress often is asking for change, sometimes uncomfortable change, for our better well-being, our greater well-being and health. And so the Enchantress kind of gets a bad rap because oftentimes it comes up in great need with a good deal of discomfort and difficult emotions related to the changes that we might be feeling called to make. That might be difficult decisions to make. So the Enchantress can be a bit edgy and uncomfortable. And goodness gracious, that's often the best times to get a massage or some body work. And also body work can be very challenging in that we might encounter painful places or difficult places in our bodies that correspond to these difficulties that we may have been numb to, or we may not have been aware of. And then it makes us aware of, oh, there's some attention that I need to start paying to my body and my whole being in a new way. And so, the Enchantress aspects of body work are very fascinating to look into, and how we hold that as a massage therapist and body worker. I've been working with this question for my whole career. Over a quarter century here, I've been working with, okay, do we dive into the painful spots? Do we hold them in the comfort zone and just like surround them with pleasure and comfort? How do we address these difficult places? So these are big questions, and I would love for Natasha, for you to introduce yourself and share a little bit more about your background and experience, and why this topic came up for you to bring to the podcast.
Thank you, Sama, and thank you for having me. So I live in a little seaside town in the southeast of England, and I feel quite blessed to have created a really nice sanctuary for myself, my 23-year-old, her partner, my 10-year-old, and all our rescued animals. I have built a little sustainable well-being sanctuary to the rear of the house, which has given me a new way of working, being able to honor myself and my family responsibilities with more fluidity. And my work has three main threads to it, I guess. So I'm a body worker. I have been for 12, 13 years. Initially, I started off with lots of different massage training, and yoga training, and then I began to look again with fresh eyes at womb wellness, women's health practices, and that led me into craniosacral therapy, which I've been studying since 2018. And this is quite a new way of working for me. We'll talk about this a little bit more in time in this podcast. Another aspect of my work is in-person antenatal yoga. And my intention with that is to really create a fully inclusive environment for women, as prior to sort of complementary health, my background was in child health and pediatric nursing. And all the time I was seeing the people with the greatest need being unable to access the support or resources they need to make those well-being changes. So with antenatal and postnatal and baby yoga, there's no agenda apart from showing up for yourself and just being authentic with where you are in your pregnancy journey or your postnatal journey. And that's been really important, as with the pendulum, with women sort of reclaiming their birthrights and more natural birth, there's also quite a lot of societal expectation. And women can feel very frustrated and disappointed if things don't work out how they had hoped and prepared for things to work out.
Mm-hmm.
The only online offerings I offer are sort of women's wellness yoga, and that's a combination of pelvic care, core strength, restorative yoga to reset the nervous system, and looking at the mind-gut connection and hormones, and the fluctuations in our hormones in our menstrual cycle and life cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last branch of my work is in-person workshops and groups. Aromatherapy, womb health, steaming, fermented foods, labour preparation, sort of all standalone days. And the course that I'm offering at the moment, which starts in September, is a sovereignty and sisterhood course. And so I'm really excited to get going with that. It's been a good year of not having too much group interaction, so really sort of welcoming that change in, that will be run seasonally, one season at a time, or the whole year if you want a journey for the whole year through a whole range of moving medicines, body practices, dance, song, rituals, and co-created ceremonies.
Beautiful. I'm going to move to the UK and join you on that. How's that sound?
Great. It's so nice.
Can you help me with my citizenship? Maybe we have to get married.
Are you available for that?
Well, we'll talk later. Anyway. All right. Well, wonderful. Thank you for sharing this in such thorough detail about all of your work. And I'm already hearing in as you describe some of these things, like this sovereignty and sisterhood, sounds like the Enchantress could be very involved in that, you know, coming together in sovereignty. For me, feels like an important part of what the Enchantress is teaching us. Teaching us to really connect to our own inner wisdom and create structures in our relationships and in our lifestyles and in our lives and our communities that support us to be in our sovereignty and to be true to our core essence, our soul purpose. And so sovereignty and sisterhood is so important because our sisterhood, our relationships with other women can be so detrimentally influenced by the structures in society and in our relationships that we've learned that diminish our sovereignty. And so it sounds like this program with that focus and that intention is really evoking that kind of evaluation and saying, let's create healthier structures for our sisterhood relationships. So that sounds fantastic. That's why I'm like proposing to you and like, let's get together and do this. Maybe we'll do an online version of something like that. Sounds wonderful. So to the topic that you propose that we discuss, I'm really curious to hear more about what your bodywork career and the things that you've been exploring in bodywork bring forth, and how that relates with this Enchantress archetype for you.
So the reason I'm here on this podcast today is because it came up in a treatment for me, how important it was just to share, not to have anything to sell, but just to sort of start building that sisterhood and that collective sharing. And initially when the topic came up, it was more to do with the personal journey that I've had through some trauma and stepping into my authenticity and power. However, it started to change and became less about my individual journey and more about collective themes. So the archetype of the Enchantress is quite a nice anchor for that. And when I sort of, in the past, working with archetypes, I've really enjoyed the stories, the mythology, the observation of these kind of universal patterns and images. I remember reading Man and His Symbols when I was like 18 years old and being wowed by Jungian psychology and the notions of archetypes and dreams. Most of it went over my head, I have to say. I couldn't take it all in at that point. But my understanding is that Jung kind of regards the Enchantress as someone who's developed insight and understanding and the potential to be a healer and a prophet. They're quite juicy words.
Yes, very juicy words.
Years later, I became fascinated with female shamanism. I read Shakti Woman, I think in the early 90s by Vicky Noble, and the spiritual sort of embodied wisdom that we get when we honor our feminine cycles and sacred sites, and how connected we can become to the world around us. And that's when I really connected with some of the blood mysteries and looking at the menstrual cycle, which has been such a valuable tool for understanding individually and within groups how our energies fluctuate. And I think the Enchantress can be quite misunderstood. And I certainly have misunderstood the Enchantress as I've developed and grown. So from the womb awakening, we kind of think of the gifts and the shadows of the Enchantress energy. And the gifts, you know, being a really magical woman with lots of potential and creativity, well-versed in the art of manifestation, which carries a lot of responsibility, by the way. I just have to add that one in. And an embodied woman, sort of awakened and open to the pleasures of life and all that is on offer. But I think I saw the Enchantress more in my peers and in sort of relationships within my family as more of a manipulative seductress, someone who is self-serving, breaks the hearts of men, doesn't always follow through with love or promises, the kind of femme fatale, and quite competitive as well, a lot of jealousy among sisters. And I don't want to identify with the archetypes, I really recognize that the sister sitting beside me is going to have different enchantress qualities to those that I possess, and that through our life experience, different shadows or gifts will get triggered in different situations.
Mhm.
However, what was I going to say? Integrating all these parts of this energy is really important, and there's this kind of sense of, as one matures, or as I mature, being able to have a playful curiosity with noticing different faces of the enchantress in different situations.
Mm. You know, I'm glad you're bringing up these the different aspects of the enchantress and how the shadow side of the enchantress can come into play. And for those of us who are looking at our premenstrual or perimenopausal phases of our cycle, and you know, recognizing some of these shadows, the hypercriticalness is one. I'm not sure if you mentioned that, but that can be a big thing for me, is that nothing's right and nobody can get it right, and being super grouchy and hypercritical with everyone in my life and in my relationships and with the world in general, and that comes from that ability to evaluate, that heightened need to evaluate everything and discern what is working well and what's not working well. But it can, you know, based on our overall health and well-being and trauma patterns that we're playing out still because they're unresolved as yet, and we're holding them in our bodies, based on the level of physical toxicity and emotional toxicity that we haven't cleared out yet, or we haven't balanced out, and hormonal imbalances. It can go too far, and to that point of hypercriticalness where nothing's right, everything's wrong, and I'm just going to harp on everything and everyone, and it can take us to that, you know, especially if we suppress those kinds of feelings, anger or frustration, the whole rest of the month and from the whole rest of our lives, and we have an energy or a practice of suppressing those energies within us, especially from past traumas that never got worked through, then it can all come out erupting in our premenstrual, you know, phase of each month, but then even more so in that perimenopausal phase where it just gets stronger and stronger. And so it feels really important through body work and other holistic health healing practices that you've talked about and that I talk about a lot, to really help with some of the physical toxicity levels through dietary change and herbal therapies, as well as in the body work is so helpful. The breathing, the touch, the, you know, helping the body to release tension patterns and structures of that are responses to past or current ongoing traumas, and helping to release the nervous system from fight and flight mode back into rest and renew mode. Because when we're in that fight and flight mode, that can really exacerbate that or it can switch that natural evaluatory tendency at that time. It can flip it to hypercritical, got to get in a fight. There's a fight that needs to happen here, right? Got to fight this, instead of having a sober look at things and saying and making a a long-term strategy for positive change, right? It's two very different approaches. If you're fighting with things, or if you're at peace and you're looking at a healing process that means making some changes. That's two very different ways. So I feel like the body work and these other holistic healing modalities that we're talking about can really help people approach that perimenopause and that premenstrual phase and find the strengths and the wisdom of the enchantress without being overrun by the shadows of the enchantress. So I'd love to hear about your experience of all of that.
I don't think we can take the enchantress just as a single phase, because it's the autumn for menstruating women. Certainly for myself, my luteal phase of my cycle is really interrelated to how I bleed, what my follicular phase is, how I've looked after myself throughout the whole of that cycle.
Mm-hmm.
The pattern I've noticed in myself and many other women is that if we don't rest enough and almost prepare for menses, that downtime, seeing every clearing in the diary as an opportunity for more stillness,
Mm-hmm.
then we can sort of bleed heavier and more erratically, etc. So for me, the premenstrual, the luteal phase and the follicular phase are so dependent on one another.
Mm-hmm.
I have quite a lot of resilience and quite a lot of energy. So in springtime, I can get super resourceful and really have lots of creative energy for projects and getting my house in order and seeing my friends and my colleagues and putting my passion into life.
Mm-hmm.
And that's great. It's really, really good to use that window of opportunity of when my energy is ascending and growing to do that. There's a balance to be had as well. So if that is too much emotional investment and too much energy, then come the premenstrual phase, there's a sense of overwhelm, of depletion, of exhaustion. And with that, you know, more irritability, less tolerance, etc. And if I don't use that springtime when I have got more available energy, if I'm quite cautious and coy with it, then I tend to notice a pattern of retaining more fluid, a little bit more stagnation, and more cravings, and a dissatisfaction that can also manifest itself, you know, in that sort of wilder, irritable woman, and has the knock-on effect of affecting how I bleed and how others bleed as well. There seems to be a sort of a theme running through the cycle. So that enchantress energy seems very linked with that maiden energy and that mother energy with the crone energy. In my observations, if I use that sort of summertime and prepare for when I'm gonna have less energy, do a bit of batch cooking, a little bit of detoxing, you know, good nutrition, getting out and having treatments, then when I menstruate, it's a more enjoyable experience. And
you know, I just want to mention too that what you're sharing about the enchantress relationship with the maiden, mother, and crone phases, it's not only in the menstrual cycle but in the whole cycle of our lives, because that maiden premenstrual time, just before we start bleeding as young women, is a big moment of enchantress energy. of like becoming aware of our soul purpose, of our calling in life for the first time. And it's often unsupported, completely unsupported by whatever circumstances we're in as young women coming of age. Rarely is it supported, more and more commonly becoming supported, because over these lifetimes of feeling what it's like to live without that, we're starting to wake up to the importance of that again. And so then that in the mother phase of our menstruating fertile years, it's happening every month that the Enchantress is like checking in with us and saying, how is your life aligning with everything? How are you caring for yourself every month, just like you were talking about? And then letting us know the results of that by how we feel as we're moving into menstruation and during menstruation every month. Like it's a check-in for how we're doing. And so the Enchantress is really with us, like you say, our whole lives. And then the Enchantress's job is to help us to prepare for our life's magic, like the gift that we have to offer the world, the medicine that we're here to bring, and how to alchemize any of our traumas, any of the difficulties we've experienced in our lives into that medicine. And so then as we're coming into our crone years, where it's really about delivering the full potency of that medicine that we're here to bring to the world, then the Enchantress is just like right there, yes, this is it. It's like the full development. So you're so right with that. In each menstrual cycle, the Enchantress is there the whole way, and yet there is a strengthening and intensification of that energy in that premenstrual phase. And it's the same with the whole cycle. Yes, the Enchantress is here guiding the way, and then she really starts talking loud in perimenopause if we haven't been paying attention until then.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And so I just want to, so you mentioned getting receiving bodywork sessions to help with that, caring for yourself properly and not getting to that place of overwhelm during the follicular phase in your menstrual cycle. And this is such wisdom, because it is very very tempting to go all out and completely overboard during that springtime when we might have a lot of energy. And if we have a tendency to neglect our needs, to just go out and do all the things and not take care of ourselves, and then we have the crash, right? But if we're having a more sustainable approach to that and saying, while I'm exerting all of this energy, while I'm flowing with all of this creative energy, it's important to also nourish myself and have rest at those times as well, then I'm less likely to crash into my Enchantress phase, that autumn phase. It's more of a gentle falling of leaves instead of like the whole tree falling down, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I think if you give more than you can afford to, that's when one seems to crash more.
Yeah. And go ahead.
Being a mother, having relationships, often, we give a lot in those situations. And sometimes I think a lot of people neglect themselves in that process. We get so caught up in the archetype of the perfect mother and how we nurture and nourish our children that we can leave ourselves quite depleted, and then that often will show up in our cycles as well.
Yeah, so the Enchantress is really wanting to let us know how we've done the whole rest of the month prior, and how we're doing in the whole rest of our lives, right? And it's that moment of like reflection of like, wow, I'm feeling like crap, I just want to fight everybody. How could I take better care of myself this next month? And
the cycle begins again, and we have to reflect and learn and put our knowledge into practice.
Right. And so often in that enchantress phase, it's easy to point the finger at other people and say, if they would do this, then I would feel better. But what I'm hearing you share, and what's in my experience too, is that yes, if we're in a toxic relationship or a toxic setting that's not good for us, then one of the things that we might need to do to take care of ourselves is to remove ourselves from those situations. But in order to really determine whether that's really what the current situation is, or whether we're just projecting our memory from past situations we've already gotten out of, I found that it's really important that I'm taking really good care of myself and giving myself what I'm wishing other people would give to me first. And when I do that, then I often notice, oh, wait a second, they are doing the things that I want them to do in my healthy relationships. Like, they are doing those things. I just couldn't see it because I wasn't doing it for myself, and I felt like crap. And so everything felt like crap, right? And so it's really important to do both of those things, of like really take stock of what the nature of any relationship we're in really is about. And if we're really being cared for by the people in our lives and the situations, but also to really be caring for ourselves in like all the ways that you were talking about, nourishing ourselves, getting the kinds of therapeutic sessions we need, resolving the trauma patterns within our bodies and in our psyche, in order to, so that we know that we're not just painting everything with that same old brush.
Yeah, holding healthy boundaries. That's one of the qualities of the Enchantress, is knowing thyself to look after oneself.
Right.
Yeah. So in terms of body work, a lot of people come, and the same I found with yoga retreats, you know, their lives are so stressful, they're not really making the changes in their behaviors and their perceptions, that they arrive on the couch with a kind of fix me, help me mentality. And I just need to be nurtured, I just need to be nourished, I just need to be looked after. And as a therapist, that's an honor that someone will put their trust in you to do that, and that you can give some respite and comfort and remove tensions, etc. But what I've found really fascinating is this concept of neutrality, and how we all have our own inner physician, our own wisdom, and how the gentlest of touch can be so powerful in terms of releasing what's stored in the tissues. Being neutral and holding space sometimes means that you sit for long periods of time with murky waters and stagnation in someone. But having the confidence to sit back long enough to allow that client to arrive at what they're ready to face and change in themselves is the key to sort of more long-term and transformational self-responsibility, self-accountability, sovereignty.
Beautiful.
Rather than sort of being led or guided to a place, which perhaps, you know, we can't always hear or see or feel or sense.
You know, I'm so glad you spoke to this, because, you know, you're working with the modality craniosacral, okay, which most people who have craniosacral for the first time wonder what's happening, because they haven't developed the sensitivity to feel everything, the subtle movements that are happening. And it's at least in my practice, I've noticed that it's not as popular as some of these more intense, forceful modalities like deep tissue, for example, where the practitioner is doing a whole lot of work to stir up, clear out those murky waters and stagnant areas and tension patterns, and using the strength of the practitioner to move it through. And the person feels a big shift in their whole experience in their body, but they haven't necessarily, like you described, come to that awareness of what needs to shift, how they can shift it inside of themselves. They're relying on the practitioner to do all this work for them. Whereas what you just described, which has been my experience as well, is that this more subtle being with the way that it is from a neutral perspective without manipulating anything, but just being with it and bringing awareness to the way that it is, so that the person can slowly rest into experiencing the way that it is and find their own way out of it. This is totally my experience after 25 years or more of body work, is that that's what creates the lasting change. Is that, oh, if I'm just, and in myself personally, as well as with clients, is that if they become dependent on me to fix it for them by forcefully manipulating their body, they're never going to learn how to make the changes they need to make in order for it to not keep cropping up every time. Yeah.
Yeah, it becomes a very codependent relationship. As a therapist, you need people to keep coming back to be fixed. And as a client, you are relying on your therapist to move through your body everything that you haven't taken responsibility for in terms of looking after yourself. I'm really fascinated by what we store in our tissues. You know, our tissues have memories. We know that the fascia will store memories, normally from a sense of overwhelm. Something that's happened that we couldn't process at the time, and how certainly in the school that I'm training with, and I am a student, I actually had a 7-year delay in starting my training. I'd been to a practitioner and had an incredible sort of experience of finding all this movement in my body within the stillness that was being held for me, and deep sort of insights that were really helpful for me then to change some of my less helpful schemas and behaviors. And I was so enthusiastic, I couldn't wait to get started with my training. But the first course I enrolled on was cancelled. And then every year I was blocked and I couldn't get on a course. There was stuff going on and it just made it impossible. When I finally got on my first course, I had a really profound somato-emotional release and lots of spontaneous movement in my body. My left arm just shot out to the side, my head turned to the right, and I became really aware of fear and anger being held in these tissues. And I didn't know why. I have no conscious recollection of what my non-conscious was bringing up to me. So I had to go and do a little bit of digging and researching and starting to put things together. Within the context of a training environment, it was acknowledged that I was going into a process, but that fellow students didn't have the skills or the expertise to hold me safely in that process. And so I was asked to have that dual awareness of bringing myself back into the present, looking around the room, knowing that I'm safe, filing it, that there's work to be done there. And then I was invited to attend an intensive program of 5 days of deep craniosacral therapy with a lot of body dialoguing, with really skilled and experienced practitioners in a multi-hands environment. So more than one practitioner holding my tissues on the body, in my body. And the multi-hands works incredibly fascinating, how therapists can link up through the tissues. So you can have an area within the body that's holding, and it's palpable that there's tension there. Now, we don't know as therapists what that tension is, but we know that the client on the table will be able to put all those pieces together and get a sense of what's going on, and that their actual craniosacral rhythm, so this continual pulse, is their inner wisdom, that pulse will suddenly cease and switch off, and it will recruit the therapist to listen really carefully with their hands and to find out from the client's own words what is significant in their unwinding and their process, and hearing the words and the tissues simultaneously. So lots of very open-ended questions, you know, tell me more. What does this mean to you? And so on and so forth. So that one stays blended and melded, but neutral and witnessing and just holding that client in their process and in their space.
So beautiful how you describe how that process can take place, and then and how the craniosacral rhythm is actually the inner wisdom of the person, and how it can begin to communicate with the therapist and primarily with the person, right? Because we might not be able to feel our own craniosacral rhythm. We might not be able to feel our own inner wisdom or hear the voice of our own inner wisdom, and a skilled therapist helps to reconnect us with that and to interpret what it's trying to tell us. I mean, that's a lot of what my work is about as a womb awakening mentor and facilitator. It feels primary and centrally important to, in my sessions with folks, to help them connect with that inner wisdom. And it sounds like that the way you describe that with the craniosacral is so potent. And that's exactly what the Enchantress is about for me. The Enchantress archetype is helping us get in touch with our inner wisdom, our inner guidance, our soul purpose, our divine essence, right? And that's if what I'm hearing you say is correct, that's the craniosacral rhythm is one way to get in touch with that, and having skilled therapists who who are trained to feel that and help us to feel it and help us to notice what is blocking us from embodying that wisdom in all parts of our body. Because it sounds to me like, you know, when you're holding, when a therapist is holding a part of the person's body where there's tension and bringing the awareness there, it makes that person aware and makes the therapist aware that rhythm isn't flowing in that spot.
That's correct, yeah.
And that then they can feel what that feels like and why it's not flowing. And that's where that inquiry starts to come in.
And that's where transmutation takes place as well. What sits within the tissues? what's behind the anger, what's behind the fear. You know, we know they're low vibrational frequencies. You know, what's obstructing that? You know, where's the courage? Can the client sit with that long enough to begin to allow? And sometimes, you know, there can be quite significant pulsing, heat, discomfort, lots and lots of different signs of release. As we move, you know, towards higher vibrational frequencies, when we start to come into our sort of courage, our acceptance, our self-realization, and, you know, even into sort of peace and moments of bliss and enlightenment. So it's not always about trauma release, but generally it's the trauma that gets stored in the tissues more than the higher vibrational frequencies of, you know, they tend to pass through us more so. They don't get lodged in the body in such a physical, mechanical, emotional, psychological way, because we're designed to flow. Our emotions, energy in motion, they are designed to flow through us. And that's our natural state of being. But, you know, as humans, it's normal for us not to have emotional fluidity, for us to get a whole heap of trauma and experiences just stored layer upon layer upon layer. That's part of being a human and how we navigate. But our natural state is one that's much more fluid than that.
Well, it's normal. Yeah, it's normal now in the developmental phase that we're in, where as humans, the collective of humanity is experimenting, I like to say, with what it feels like to be disconnected from our natural state and not fully embodying, you know, our full potential and capacity, with some very self-destructive behavior patterns and collective structures that I feel like you know, even though you talk about the anger and some other emotions that people associate as low vibration, I feel like there is a fruitful side of those emotions that, you know, when you said that, it reminded me of someone who did some writing. I can't give the name of who I'm quoting, but I'm not even quoting them exactly. But the gist of what they were writing about is that our anger is the part of us that really loves us and doesn't want our boundaries to continue to be violated, and doesn't want that doesn't want us to continue to experience traumas and wants things to be different. And that's the wisdom and the gift of the anger. And the anger can be a very powerful fuel and motivation for making those kinds of changes, of getting, you know, changing the way that we care for ourselves, making sure that we're, you know, in healthy relationships with others that have the capacity to also match and meet how we're caring for ourselves when we are doing our best to care for ourselves, and that aren't just going to continue to put us down and abuse us, right? Even if we're caring for ourselves. So that anger is a powerful catalyst for healthy change if we're taking self-responsibility and looking for the wisdom of it and letting it motivate us to love ourselves. If we're just using the anger to blame everyone and everything else and not take responsibility, then that just can keep us circulating in that trauma zone, and you know, that low vibration place like you're talking about, whereas
in a contracted state of being.
Exactly.
You know?
Yeah.
When we're really angry, our blood vessels contract, our heart contracts. we can sustain that for short periods of time, but it's when those emotions get lodged in the body and repressed for prolonged periods of time that they can be unhealthy and start to cause disease within the body.
Yeah. But what I would say about that is that it's the suppression of the anger that causes everything to contract. And not to say that full-blown explosion of anger is the solution, because a full-blown explosion of the anger of blaming everybody else and everything else and being violent towards, verbally and perhaps even physically towards everyone else, that's not the solution either. But certainly allowing ourselves to feel the anger and let it flow through us as opposed to suppressing it actually can ignite greater circulation, and moving with the anger, letting ourselves feel it and letting it motivate us towards healthy, positive movement and growth and change in our lives. Then when we can learn how to do that, which takes some learning, especially for women for whom anger has been a largely forbidden and suppressed emotion for so long, because when we do learn how to be in healthy relationship with our anger, is very powerful. That Enchantress can create amazing change very effortlessly, where just it's so beautiful when we activate that Enchantress power and start to let those emotions flow in a healthy way, in a self-responsible way. The power of what change can occur is really threatening to the status quo. That's why it's been so suppressed for so long, and why we're so rigorously trained to not let ourselves feel our anger and to contract around our anger and not let it flow. So I just wanted to make sure that we, how does that sound to you?
We're on the same page with that, definitely.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, listen, we've gone 15 minutes over the time that we had agreed upon. So I just wanted to invite us to, hold any additional aspects of this conversation until perhaps a part 2, that we come together and discuss. Although it seems like we covered a lot of things, we could go farther into the whole process that you described. I'd love to hear more about this process of trauma release through body work, and how these Enchantress energies are, and other energies. We're going to be starting to talk more about ancestral healing, and the different aspects of healing around that, like what we've inherited from our family patterns and family generational patterns of tension that we've inherited, and how we can start to unravel that. And bodywork, I'm sure, I know for myself, I'm sure for you, is a wonderful way to start to access some of that as well. So perhaps our next one we'll get into some of that, our next podcast episode. But for now, I would love to invite you to share, if folks wanted to talk to you about, connect with you about anything that we've been talking about, how can they get a hold of you?
So the best way to connect with me is via my websites. There's email contact forms on both. The first one is more the women's health work, which is innatewisdom.co.uk. And the second one is the clinic, which is more than just myself, breatheinspaceclinic.co.uk. I'm not active on social media at the moment. I might dabble in the future again, but I'm quite enjoying my anonymity and community.
Beautiful. So thank you so much for sharing where we can get in touch with you. And listeners know that if you'd like to learn more about what's going on in the womb-centered healing community, you can go to wombcenteredhealing.com and sign up for the newsletter there. And then you'll get announcements about the latest podcast episodes, blog articles, and upcoming courses and events. So we'll look forward to hearing from you soon. That's all for now. until next time.
Thank you, Salma. Bye-bye.
Bye.